Fortun glaze now.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here or in your houses. Welcome to our next section of these biosocial talks. This is CIUS, the Research Center for Anthropology and Health initiative to bring the public a series of lectures on anthropological approaches to health, disease, different ways of life and human diversity in both past and living societies. We had already 5 presentations on topics as diverse as dental anthropology, the effects of violence on child development, malaria, and we will end next week, I think, I think the presentation today is also an area that I designate, I don't know if it is correct or not, something like ecology of sanitation. We will see. So thanks for being on that side of the screen. And thank you very much to the colleagues that who did these invitations, in this case to Gonçalo. I also thank Vitor Matos and Daniela for the arrangement of the most practical and some bureaucratic questions. And I'm going to give the floor to Gonçalo, so he can introduce Nick Cave. After the presentation, we will have opportunity to have some discussion and questions. If Gonçalo is okay to be here, better. If not, I think we can manage that. I hope from these sections that we will have next week new ideas for the future will emerge concerning the work that we do in CE. So many things, Gonçalo.
Thank you, Cristina. Welcome once again to BioSocial Talks. And thank you, Cristina and Vitor and Daniela for making this series possible. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm an assistant professor of social and cultural anthropology in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. And I'm also a researcher at this university's Research Center for Anthropology and Health. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Nicholas Kawa, whose talk will introduce in the series the question of waste, sanitation, and human-environment relations. As Cristina put it so aptly, the question of ecologies of sanitation, right? Nick is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Ohio State University. He is also a core faculty member of this university's Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation, INFACT. That's the acronym. Nick is the author of the book, Amazonia in the Anthropocene, People, Soils, Plants, Forests, published by University of Texas Press in 2016. A wonderful book that explores the history and ethnography of human-environment relations in Amazonia through the lens of larger global debates on the Anthropocene and the future of human life on the planet. Nick's research has appeared in major scholarly journals such as American Anthropologist, Current Anthropology, Human Ecology, and Human Organization. He has also published in popular outlets such as NPR and The Atlantic, The Conversation, and Sapiens. His current research examines how human-produced excesses, bodily, agricultural, and industrial, have come to shape the ecologies of the Anthropocene, not just in Amazonia, but also in the American Midwest. His most recent project, funded by a post-PhD grant from the Vannegrand Foundation, specifically investigates the use and management of biosolids, treated human waste, for agricultural production and urban gardening in the contemporary US. Today's talk, I believe, Nick, will focus on this research project. The title is The Afterlives of Sanitation Waste in Urban Green Spaces of the Late Industrial US. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nick Kawa. Nick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Boa tarde a todos e todas. When Gonzalo had sent me an email to invite me, I was really excited about this opportunity to share my research with all of you at Coimbra. Of course, it would be nice to be in Portugal with you all, but maybe in a different occasion that could be possible. And when he had contacted me, I was like, oh, talvez eu possa escrever texto em português, seria legal fazer isso, mas como vocês sabem, o tempo vai voando, aí resolvi escrever em inglês. So I have a text here that I've composed as Gonzalo is very generously introducing this project. I've been developing research on how sanitation waste is being rediscovered as a resource for fertilization, for ecological restoration, for sites of landscaping and urban agriculture. And so this talk today is the first attempt that I'm really making of trying to take some of this ethnographic material that I've been developing in Chicago, looking at the use of sanitation waste known as biosolids and its use in urban green spaces in the city of Chicago, which was something I didn't expect when I started developing this research. So I will admit that this was an amazing opportunity for me to work through this material. A lot of it is uneven. So I'm looking forward to your feedback and points of discussion, because I'm still really at the beginning phase of trying to think through the analysis of some of the ethnographic material that I'll share with you. So I did develop a short text, and hopefully I won't go too long. I think maybe 35 minutes max that I'll be talking, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion, and I'm looking forward to that very much. So I'll jump right into it if this works. There we go. As a popular euphemism in Portuguese indicates, shitting is an act of human necessity, fazer as necessidades, no? But with the rise of the hydraulic sanitation system in Europe and other industrialized regions of the world, today, fewer and fewer of us have any direct responsibility in managing this basic fact of life. So what my current research asks is, what happens once we flush our toilets, and what becomes of our so-called waste? And to answer these questions, I've been investigating how human bodily excesses, along with many other forms of waste, are channeled into hydraulic sanitation systems, processed, treated, and then recaptured as resources, which are known today as biosolids. To be clear, the use of human waste as a resource is nothing new. The practice of applying human excrement as a fertilizer on agricultural lands has a long history dating back thousands of years. And I think Gonzalo will probably be talking a bit about this in his research and looking at this history and its legacies in East Asia and China specifically. But here in this talk today, I want to draw attention to how the city of Chicago has been increasingly directing its sanitation waste or biosolids into urban green spaces. So rather than trafficking it into the rural countryside, which has long been its primary destination, more and more of the city's sanitation waste is being composted and applied on recreational sites, including public and private golf courses, municipal sports fields, elevated outdoor trails that are part of urban renewal efforts, and city parks. So these are what I call the unexpected afterlives of human waste that I'm hoping to explore further with you today. Now, this talk builds on a larger project that I began 5 years ago, interviewing wastewater treatment workers, soil scientists, environmental chemists, engineers, manure spreaders, and farmers in the United States to understand the problems and possibilities for using biosolids as a renewable resource in industrial agriculture, urban gardening, ecological restoration projects, and even green energy production. From a more critical perspective, however, I've begun to think about biosolids as situated within much broader late industrial ecologies of excess. And here I draw inspiration from Kim Fortun's conceptualization of late industrialism as a time that's marked by the limits of available critical constructs for explaining issues of concern within environmental politics, which include the complexity and current state of ecological systems, the complex relationship between ecosystem and human health, and the long durée in which environmental problems become manifest. To put it more succinctly, late industrialism exceeds our conceptual grasp in large part due to the very excesses and accelerated outputs that industrial processes generate. My hope is then to extend Fortune's conceptualization of late industrialism through explicit recognition of these complex relations as ecologies of excess. In doing so, I also put this work in conversation with the growing body of research known as discard studies, which Max Liboyon defines as research and thinking about how power relations, norms, and infrastructures make some things disposable, wastable, and toxic, while other things are not. And then finally, considering the political economy of shit, I'm interested in how late capitalism finds new forms of value in human created waste, or how new regimes of value derived from waste are fundamental to the capitalist ideology of perpetual growth. One might note, perhaps a bit cynically, that social scientific researchers are not following far behind, trying to find new sources of scholarly value in distinct forms of waste that until recently were largely ignored in ethnographic inquiry, including electronic junk, marine plastics, landfills, and sanitation waste, among many other forms. To return to the empirical materials at hand, I'll focus on two sites in the city of Chicago where I've conducted ethnographic research on biosolids use, urban golf courses and multi-use city parks. Here I show how biosolids enriched landscapes can serve to extend the pleasures of late industrial outdoor recreation and environmental appreciation. This is largely possible through the city's expanded production of what they call exceptional quality biosolids compost, and this minimizes odors and public complaints of such. However, the use of biosolids also raises alarms for some urban dwellers, particularly in relation to emerging contaminants and unregulated industrial compounds present in these materials. While the impacts these may have on environmental or public health are largely speculative or uncertain, the use of treated sanitation waste as a resource in urban green spaces raises far broader questions about sustainability under late industrialism and for whom such waste can be redeemed. And I'll attempt to expand on these thoughts a bit further in the concluding section of my talk today. So let's move on to the ethnography. And I'll start with my first site of ethnographic inquiry, which is the golf course. The day before the world entered into lockdown due to the novel coronavirus pandemic, I was on the phone with Steve, a superintendent of a public golf course on the south side of Chicago. Steve had been indicated to me by an environmental scientist working for the city, and I was told he was someone with expertise in the practical application of biosolids. Although my initial research interest centered on the use of biosolids in agriculture and urban gardening, I'd begun to find more and more cases of it being applied on recreation sites in the city, including social spaces marked by distinctive class privilege, such as country clubs and golf courses. The simple idea that the city's shit was sustaining elite forms of recreation like golf seemed to call for further investigation. At the onset of our interview, Steve told me, I come to golf course management from an environmental perspective. He elaborated on this point, noting his advocacy for planting native prairie grasses and other vegetation in the roughs of the golf course, while also committing to minimal use of pesticides. You know, we still have to have a golf course, he joked, so you can't get away from using pesticides, but you can make your footprint as light as possible, he told me. And through this environmental approach, he had developed something of a reputation in his professional field. In 2005, Steve's golf course had become part of a biosolids study led by a researcher from the University of Illinois, along with soil scientists from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of the city of Chicago. The city funded the study and provided the resources to comparatively assess the application of synthetic fertilizers alongside the city's biosolids. Steve explained that his golf course had disturbed soils with very little topsoil and heavy clays. And ultimately, what the research showed was that biosolids served not only as a good fertilizer, but also a good soil amendment, even helping with some diseases that were prominent in areas of the course that suffered from low fertility. And best of all, it was free. The fact that I was able and still am able, Steve told me, to call up the Water Reclamation District and say, hey, send over 13 semi-loads, and it would literally show up in a couple of days in our parking lot. And it wouldn't cost me a dime, he shared with me in partial amazement. However, Steve did elaborate on some of the problems he experienced with biosolids use too. Specifically, we got into the issue of managing odors. While the city has worked diligently to minimize the odors of biosolids because it's widely known to be a barrier to adoption and acceptance of use, Steve told me there were marked differences between the city's diverse biosolids products. Biosolids that were only air dried, he said, had a better profile for use as fertilizer, or at least he told me the effects were more noticeable, but their odor posed a significant problem. When it gets wet, it gives off this total barnyard cattle lot smell, Steve told me. By contrast, the composted EQ, or exceptional quality biosolids, only produced a slight musk at times and were far less offensive to the nose. Steve explained that if he used the air-dried biosolids during the golfing season, it would be simply objectionable to his players. Not to mention, he noted that golf shoes pick it up and golf cart tires do too. So for this reason, Steve and his team have made the determination that they're only going to apply air-dried biosolids in the off-season when golfers are not present. I then asked Steve if the use of biosolids was something that many golfers at the course were aware of, or like most of the general public, did they probably have very little idea about it? He responded by telling me that we, quote, tout the fact that we use it. And he explained further, if you visit the course's webpage under the About tab, you can find information about biosolids application and all sorts of other efforts the golf course is making to go green. And so I think, here I've been sort of thinking about what can we kind of derive from the experience of someone like Steve and others who I've interviewed. There are other golf courses throughout the city that are using biosolids, and what can we kind of derive from these cases analytically. And I think, one of the things that sort of stands out is what's interesting is this sort of ethos of environmentalism that drives Steve's management of this course and his use of biosolids, that is seen as kind of part of an ecological or environmental ethic to reuse this resource that is available in the city. But that's also undergirded by this sort of economic benefit, right? So it's kind of this win-win, like we can go green, but we can also save money because the city is providing this material free of cost. And some of you may wonder, well, why is the city just giving this material away? And in my interviews with others in the city of Chicago and those working for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, historically, much of this material was being sent out into the countryside and was sent on trucks. And there's logistical sort of management issues with it, but there's also just the sheer cost of trucking this at great distances beyond the city. And so the way that was explained to me as part of the city's effort has been to try to divert more and more of this material within the city limits to cut down on those costs and obviously maximize the sort of efficiency of distribution of this material. And so, Steve can justify this as an environmental or ecological sort of move that he's making, but it's also saving him money. And so part of, his ability to use it is because of this reduction of costs. So it becomes this kind of win-win. I think it's also notable that the only way that Steve can use this material and continue to maintain this practice is as long as it doesn't offend the golfers and users of this park. And so this is why this kind of practice of developing this EQ biosolids is so important, because in other circumstances in cities where they don't have high quality biosolids compost, odors emanating from these materials are oftentimes offensive to the public, raise concerns, and have made it very difficult for cities to find effective uses for them. So there's also this aspect of sort of infrastructural investment on the part of the city to make this happen. And the last thing that I think is kind of fascinating here is how these materials are being used in what I describe as these elite social spaces. When I first started this project, I was looking at a lot of the use of biosolids in agricultural areas with very small kind of populations where few people were exposed to them. And what's interesting in the city of Chicago is that it's not small rural communities that are using it. You have, areas of very kind of elite, wealthy, urban industrial communities that are making use of this material. And, I think whether the wealthy communities that are benefiting from biosolids are aware of it or not, the simple fact remains that they are kind of taking advantage of all this sort of infrastructural investment to render shit, less, render it more palatable, more acceptable, and less offensive. And we can talk about some of the kind of paradoxes and contradictions about that at the end. I'll move on to the second site, which is Maggie Daley Park. While Steve's golf course promoted the benefits of biosolids on their website, many recreation areas in Chicago that rely on biosolids rarely publicize or even necessarily acknowledge their use of it. Still, biosolids have served as the foundation for several new urban redevelopment projects that are reshaping the city of Chicago and its image in the late industrial period. Perhaps the most central and iconic recreational space in downtown Chicago is Millennium Park, with its now famous bean or cloud gate sculpture that stands as a key focal point. Adjacent to it is Maggie Daley Park, a 25-acre green space largely populated with native prairie grasses planted in over 6,000 cubic yards of Chicago's exceptional quality biosolids compost. And this is right here at the center of the city, and what's called in Chicago as the Loop, is kind of the central focal point of downtown. The biosolids used in these landscapes most certainly do not smell. But what do they sound like? Shortly after arriving in Chicago to begin research in August of 2019, I had stopped in an independent bookstore and purchased 2 booklets with exercises and experiments in deep listening. On the train back to my Airbnb, I thumbed through these sonic meditations, wondering how attention to sound rather than smell might open new lines of inquiry. In other words, what might deep listening at Maggie Daley Park tell us about the use of biosolids in the late industrial city, as well as the social worlds that biosolids have, at least in part, helped to create? The following day, strolling through Maggie Daley Park with my audio recorder in hand, I attempted to apply these lessons in deep listening. There I heard drums from the Frank Gehry designed amphitheater boom across the space as people more like ants with smartphones crawl around and snap pictures of loved ones to share with other loved ones on the internet. Water trickles in from the Lurie Gardens, then more water trickling, falling, flowing, my breathing. A man leads a tour of visitors and points out to the gardens and says, "The great thing is that these plants inhabited the Great Plains and this area." At Maggie Daley Park's western entrance, the wind blows through the microphone, rumbling. A woman asks a companion, "Want to go this way?" Sounds of sprinklers tending to the thirsty grass. A helicopter flies overhead. Car traffic on Columbus Drive. In the distance, footsteps. The quiet chirp of crickets grows until it's not so quiet at all, but ringing loudly, brightly. A sprinkler stream hits the trunk of a skinny tree. A bird chirps. The wind comes at the little microphone in my recorder, even harder. I stopped to jot down some notes, scratching onto paper: sprinklers, car traffic, helicopter, cricket, Spanish and English and Japanese, the breeze. A long line of preschool children in yellow vests. I hear one of the children say, "Are we going this way?" And an adult, "Watch out, friends, move over." Long strides, crickets with different pitches, rhythms, car traffic, the air. A white man in scrubs walks by talking about the overcast sky to someone on his cell phone. The sun has yet to come out. He tells the person on the phone, but yesterday it did while I was out on the boat. And so I got a good, nice, what works for me as a suntan, which is really a red, I get red. People walk by, chatting, give me water, one says. I have an imaginary pet, a young girl states plainly. I don't catch her comment on my audio recorder. I later write it down. More chatter from people. Yeah, I mean, we are, but mainly the rumble of the microphone, crickets, cars, crickets, chatter, children's voices, men's voices, all indistinct. Where are we going? At the end of my recordings, I find a public art piece that is painted on the ground in black and white in a long swoosh-like shape. It defies audio capture, but shares the following sequence of statements. Assuming a position, presume a destination. One can only imagine the powers that be. Imagine things can be altered to suit. Spit into the wind, hope for the best. The destination is straight on, out of sight. Now, of course, I can't help but think what remains out of sight is not just our individual or collective destinations, but also the biosolids that sustain the prairie grasses, trees, and other landscape features of this urban park. Admittedly, these sounds and snippets of conversation and word images might not really tell us anything about biosolids in any directly meaningful way, but they might tell us something about the types of environments that biosolids can create or the conditions they can enable for recreation in late industrial cities. At the same time, they invite reflection on all that is obscured in this setting. This includes public concerns over biosolids due to the presence of emerging contaminants, as well as the much broader challenges of sustainability in a time of ecological crisis, not to mention the question of who shoulders these burdens and who gets to conveniently ignore them. On the train ride back from Maggie Daley Park, I listened to my interview with an environmental scientist named Dan, who I previously met to discuss the safety of biosolids. Following the US Environmental Protection Agency's guidelines, all biosolids produced in the US need to be treated to eliminate pathogens and reduce the presence of heavy metals. However, some critics have argued that the complex composition of sanitation waste, which includes diverse, unregulated industrial chemical compounds that have unknown long-term impacts on human environmental health, should prompt greater restrictions on their usage. In Dan's research, however, he showed that urban soils are often compacted and unproductive and can be contaminated too, especially with lead. He has shown that biosolids can help to immobilize heavy metals in soils due to their interactions with iron and aluminum oxides. Depending on the environmental history of a site, it appeared that biosolids could offer other benefits for urban application, including the ability to contend with existing pollutants in city soils. But convincing the general public of this point for Dan was a different story. In our interview, Dan told me, I've seen the whole gamut from people who say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, to others who say, I don't want to touch this stuff because they see it no differently than raw sludge. Some will get into the nitty gritty of the composition of biosolids, but this can lead down the rabbit hole of trace contaminants and distinguishing parts per million from parts per billion. He continued on stating, the conversations always come down to that. What do the trace concentrations really mean? Then, I always tell them that the tool for understanding this is risk assessment, which can also be a pretty complex conversation when you start talking about dose response and exposure pathways. Some people go right along with it and they'll engage the conversation. And other people, as soon as you start talking about risk assessment, they're done. Anything greater than 0 is problematic for them. Dan stated further, having studied so much environmental chemistry and having been involved in risk assessments and doing so many risk assessments, it all makes logical sense to me. But for someone in the general public, maybe who has a minimal amount of general chemistry or hasn't seen or heard of risk assessment processes, all they see is a list of chemicals and concentrations. So then someone tells them, hey, this is toxic waste, and it's easy to draw that conclusion. I told Dan that even for someone like myself who has advanced degrees but lacks a background in chemistry, it can be hard to fully grasp the complexity of the chemical soup in which we live. I then asked him if there were any contaminants that he, with his professional training and expertise, did have worries about. he responded in the following manner. So the argument I would say, if I'm coming from that perspective of critiquing biosolids, is that while many things are analyzed, there are many that we are not testing. He also noted that while testing for individual compounds may occur, we don't necessarily know about their synergistic effects, whether they enhance their toxicity or diminish it through interaction. Interestingly, he noted that there's, in his words, a cultural difference between the US and Europe. He stated that in the US, we wait to see if something's harmful and then we regulate it. In Europe, something has to be proven to be not harmful. But he concluded, we've been using biosolids in this way for 30 to 40 years. And ultimately, Dan didn't seem especially concerned about emerging contaminants that might be present in biosolids. Most of the city's analyses and tests, he assured me, show that any emerging contaminants present in biosolids occur at relatively low concentrations, even lower concentrations than you might find in your home. But it still made me wonder about the hundreds of thousands of unregulated industrial chemicals that course through the hydraulic sanitation system, as well as the potential synergies among them. Of course, it would be nearly impossible to build and mobilize a scientific apparatus that could test and account for all of these compounds, residues, and their relations. The question then that Dan posed to me is, if we demand to know whether biosolids are safe in such simplified terms, then we should also be asking, is your flame retardant mattress safe? Is the triclosan in your toothpaste safe? Are the dioxins in the dust bunnies under the couch in your living room safe? His point was that in our daily lives, we are all continuously exposed to these potential problems and the deep uncertainties they pose. They are all potential threats to human and environmental health. And yet the answer to whether they are safe or not really asks for other questions, ones that are less straightforward or less intuitive. What is the exposure and dose rate? What is the weight of evidence that it has clear effects on human health? What are the trade-offs for having a flame retardant mattress in the event of a fire when 60 seconds can mean the difference between saving your child's life or not? Clearly, the conditions of late industrialism are far different from those of only a few hundred years ago. And as such, they require negotiation with a whole series of different questions, concerns, and modern messes that are not so easily cleaned up. Yes, triclosan and PFOAs and PCBs run through the waste stream, as do Viagra, Xanax, Prozac, Vicodin, and many other pharmaceuticals and personal care products that individuals consume and excrete. But with the growing ecological crisis before us, environmental engineers and wastewater treatment workers whom I've met seem to argue that we simply cannot afford to hide from our waste anymore. And so here, a subtle irony begins to reveal itself. Biosolids that are applied on golf courses and city parks enable people to experience the joys of late industrial nature in its flourishing. But these pleasures also conceal and obscure much deeper uncertainties about late industrial ecologies of excess that define contemporary urban life. At this point in the talk, I was working through this ethnographic material for the first time, and so I was trying to develop some coherent analyses of what this all means. And I don't think I have that coherent analysis or framework today, but I will pose here some remaining kinds of thoughts and questions that some of this material has provoked for me and maybe for some of you. And so I'll kind of put a series of these questions out here, and then I'll try to wrap up with a short conclusion. One of the things that has kind of come to my attention as I've been working on this project is that it's clear that natural resources are becoming more scarce and human wastes are becoming more abundant. If we look at the case, for example, of phosphorus that's used in industrial agricultural production, at least here in this country in the United States, the majority of this phosphorus is rock phosphate that's mined in Florida. But those deposits are quickly being depleted. And so then the question is, for the future of industrial agriculture, if we're going to continue to have industrial agriculture, or any forms of agriculture, where are we going to be sourcing phosphorus, which is, a key plant nutrient along with nitrogen and potassium. And so one, area of interest and investment is capturing phosphorus, which is abundant in sanitation, and redirecting that into forms that can be utilized. But I think as we're seeing the shift away from natural resources to the management of human waste, there are new technical and ethical challenges that arise in the use of the latter. And that's something that's, abundantly clear here in the use of biosolids. On one hand, I think it makes an incredible amount of sense to capture biosolids as a resource and apply it onto depleted agricultural lands and lands that require ecological restoration, and also their possibility for use in recreation sites. But there are a great deal of uncertainties tied with them. And I'm not necessarily against biosolids. I've used biosolids in my own sort of garden, but I think there's a ongoing sort of debate about what are the appropriate contexts and of use. And there is a great diversity of forms of biosolids depending on sanitation infrastructural investments of individual cities where they're being produced. And I think there's really a lack of consensus, both in the scientific community, but also clearly in the general, more broader publics about, what is the appropriate place for biosolids in late industrial life. Another kind of question that's arisen for me is, how's the movement for environmental sustainability also feed directly into growth-oriented market capitalism? And I think if you look at the case, for example, of Steve and the management of his golf course, like he sees himself as an environmentalist in his management of his golf course. And I think he's genuine in that it's part of his sort of ethic of management is thinking about environmental questions and ecological ones. But at the same time, is that part of the reason he's using biosolids is because it is more cost effective and it's being offered to the city. And the reason why the city is offering it for free is because they're trying to maximize the efficiency of their management of this resource and to drop costs. And so it's always towards this goal of trying to, if not maximize profit, minimize profit loss in the case of public works, but also increase efficiency, which I think very much falls in line with kind of this ideology of growth-oriented market capitalism, in which profit seeking is designed for continuous growth and constant searching for efficiency and systems under management. This, in a related way, this kind of raises this question of the circular economy, which has become a common model and construct in business schools and sort of the corporate sphere. Is this really just late capitalism feeding off the excesses of its own making? And so we can kind of think about that image of the Ouroboros, of the snake eating its tail. And in a lot of ways, we see that there are an acceleration of production of diverse forms of waste, and then there is a need to kind of reincorporate those into the system as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And it really kind of raised this question of like, is this sustainable over the long term? And are the questions around the circular economy largely contingent on certain ideologies of kind of market capitalism? What would a different kind of circular economy that might challenge those actually look like? Another set of questions that come up is, despite the taboos surrounding human waste, how do biosolids offer new futures for bodily excesses? And I think throughout the history of looking at the use of human waste, people have found diverse, creative ways of managing bodily excess. And finding useful, productive ends for it. And I think in the development of biosolids, we're starting to see that human waste that otherwise was just kind of disregarded as waste is through kind of techno-scientific investment is finding kind of new opportunities for use. But it also kind of raises questions about how do these new forms and uses of biosolids also benefit some communities while possibly burdening others. And, an area of ethnographic research that I did not share here is that while we see some elite communities like private golf courses and country clubs, which are oftentimes very economically, socially sort of exclusive sites of kind of social recreation, while these communities are taking advantage of these exceptional quality biosolids composts in their management of their golf courses and their fairways, there are also at the same time rural communities that are having great problems with the uses of biosolids, because in some rural areas, large lagoons are being built, open lagoons, these big kind of ponds in which sanitation waste or effluent from biodigesters are capturing methane energy from those. There are 10 million gallon like lagoons that are being built next to people's homes. And then from those lagoons, companies that are using this material are applying it into the agricultural fields at specific times of year. But these communities, are concerned about how that's impacting their property values, the smells that are coming from these lagoons. And, what it comes down to is obviously there's kind of differential distribution of benefits related to biosolids, and there are differential distribution of negative impacts. And so in kind of more elite social spheres, you see how there's a great investment to kind of minimize any sort of ways in which these materials could be offensive or seen as problematic, whereas in other communities, there's less refined biosolids that people are being exposed to in ways that they do not want. And, I raised this question at the onset of kind of defining biosolids within these broader late industrial ecologies of excess. And I think it's fair to also question what makes these ecologies distinct. If we think about ecology and economy, even about always this kind of a critical facet of it is the distribution and flow of materials and resources among different kind of members of that community, whether it's a biotic community and thinking about in an ecological sense, oftentimes more than human community, but also in an economic sense of thinking about interactions among fellow human beings, what makes late industrial ecologies of excess distinct. And I think we see the sort of rate of production of waste and these outputs, the diversity of the waste that are being produced, and this incredible complexity of waste that's being produced is something that I think sets it apart in this particular era and raises questions, especially when we're looking at sanitation waste, this incredible diverse array of waste and compounds, metabolites that are being directed into our sanitation systems. If you think for a minute about all the things that goes down our toilets and sinks and drains, aside from, excrement, it's an incredible diversity of products. And you also have to think about business and manufacturing sectors as well. And all of that is channeled into a single system. And as Dan pointed out, there's a lot of unknowns about the interaction of the different sort of diverse compounds that are present in those systems. And that's what I think makes these late industrial ecologies of excess sort of distinctive. Okay, I'll try to wrap up with a conclusion, which maybe is somewhat of a pessimistic one, but hear me out. So by looking at how human waste can be transformed into a resource, I started this project with the naive hope that I might identify ways by which humanity can find its redemption in the midst of an unfolding ecological crisis. But for now, I'm not so sure. While Steve, Dan, and many others whom I interviewed have argued convincingly about the benefits of biosolids as a soil amendment and fertilizer in urban green spaces, it's hard not to think about the broader mess in which we find ourselves. In transforming shit, you see, it becomes clearer that it's not our excreta that is damaged, but rather this world, or more precisely, as Roy Scranton argues, this model of civilization. In purifying shit, we find that while our excreta may reach some redemptive future, we are left with all the other unwieldy waste that we have lost control over. We likely never had control over them in the first place. In transforming our excrement, it can become soil, earthy, rich, and brown, but there are still PFOAs and PCBs and Viagra and Xanax and antibiotic residues and triclosan to contend with. In transforming our shit, we find that it was a convenient place to hide all our other wastes, ones that I can't even pronounce, ones that I really don't know the extent to which they're harmful, ones that might simply be imagined, and ones that might have some easy technological fix, but maybe not. In purifying our shit, we strip it of heavy metals and harmful chemicals that get bound up in it as it travels through the sanitation system, only then to find that we are immersed in a big, messy chemical soup. In transforming our so-called waste, we unfurl a long line of other fears and dangers, some of which we hope to have a handle on, while many others pose deep uncertainties for our collective condition. In purifying our shit, we bring clarity to a world of impurity. It's the only world we've ever known. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nick, for this interesting subject. Really new for me. So, Gosol is there.
Hi, Nick. Would you mind stop sharing the screen? Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question while my colleagues gather their thoughts. Yes, I'm going to use the privilege of being of sharing this session, having invited you to do that. I think I have a comment and a question. I'm going to start with a comment because I thought that one of the most interesting aspects of your ethnographic materials had actually to do with smell. And I thought, I mean, this is a draft, right? This is still work in progress, and you still in very much need of feedback on which direction you're going to go. But it seemed to me that I think you could do a little bit more with that because I think it's a recurrent theme in the history of sanitation in Europe, well, across the world. And one of the things that I recall from reading a French historian, Alain Corbin, I don't know if you know his work. It's a wonderful book entitled The Foul and the Fragrant. It's a history of basically the rise of the sewage systems in Paris. And he has a wonderful passage about what he calls tactics of deodorization, which of course were crucial in the transition to sewage systems, right, to hydraulic systems of human waste management. And you are showing, it seems to me, that even today in late industrialism, as people are becoming more and more concerned with recycling human waste, that tactics of deodorization seem to be incredibly important. I mean, Steve was very concerned about the smell of biosolids in its various forms. So I think you can do a little bit more with that, and with the smell aspect of biosolids. My question, so this was my comment, right? So my question has to do with, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the larger political economy of these biosolids. It wasn't exactly, it's not clear to me, for example, how much of, let's say in Chicago, you're talking mostly about Chicago, how much of, the shit that goes into the sewers in Chicago is being turned into biosolids. Mm-hmm. And beyond Chicago, right? How much, is Chicago representative at all of the situation in the United States? I mean, there are some cities, New York to start with, it's still throwing a lot of shit straight into the ocean. In fact, many cities around the world are still doing that, even though people are not aware of it. So I think my question, I'd like you to kind of situate a little bit the phenomenon of biosolid production, right, in this larger political economy, so that we do get a sense of how realistic is your pessimistic conclusion in a way. I mean, how marginal this phenomenon is, or by contrast, how significant it actually is. And the second related question, I don't know if you want to take this question now, or if you want to take a second question, but a second, yeah.
Well, go ahead, and then and then if I have trouble remembering the second question, just remind me.
Yeah, and the second related question, probably, I think you mentioned next week I'm going to be talking about China, and of course, what you call in biosolids in the Chinese tradition has a very strong economic element. I mean, it's built into the way the economy works. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit also about that, about the economic dimensions of biosolids, because, the way you told the story, it seemed to me, okay, the government is providing this for free because it's kind of reducing the travel time and distance required to shipping this stuff to the countryside. And so why not just returning it to urban parks, which is much closer, so it's saving resources. But are there any other economic dimensions into this? I mean, could you tell us a little bit about the business of biosolids, how profitable it is, or how not profitable it is? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for both the comments and the questions, and to just kind of respond to the issue of smell. I mean, it's so big, and as time has gone on, and even if my interview with Dan, there's a whole discussion we have about smell, and really he said, like, there's three things that people are usually worried about. Number one is going to be smell. Number two is, or one and two are pathogens, like are there ways in which people can get sick from their exposure to biosolids, but then smell is always an issue. And I have like interviews with farmers in rural areas where when they apply biosolids that are not exceptional quality, there are odors. And so I have interviews with farmers that say, when they're applying that material, they go to their neighbors and they give them like, a bottle of alcohol and some candles and say, like, here is for, compensation for any sort of, discomfort you might experience the next few days or whatever. And so that's a constant issue of management, and a lot of the development for use of biosolids in cities has been around managing those odors, largely through this process of composting. In the city of Chicago, in the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, they even have, like, I found PowerPoints of presentations on, like, where they have labs of measuring smell and trying to, like, gauge, like, at what point is there a critical threshold of odors. And in other parts of this project where I'm actually working in rural Ohio in communities where there's agricultural lands that are applying biosolids, and where there's storage areas, these lagoons that I mentioned, like, that is a huge problem because those are not composted, and the odors that emanate from them are offensive to a lot of residents. And on top of that, it's the unknown composition of that material and the fact that it is also this abject waste that's produced by humans that people find to be especially offensive. So there's like a whole other kind of paper I'm working on. The title of it stinks to high heaven to us, because there are all these sort of public sort of disputes that these communities are having and meeting with the Environmental Protection Agency over permits that have been given to corporations that are managing these lagoons. Back to the question of, like, the scale of biosolids use. So I know the Environmental Protection Agency in the US estimates that about half of the sanitation waste produced in the country in hydraulic sanitation systems is returned to the land. The other remaining half then is either incinerated and burned up, and lots of cities have incinerators and maintain incinerators. And then another portion of that material is landfilled. And so here in the state of Ohio, the three kind of major metropolitan areas, we see a kind of divergence. So the city of Cleveland has always maintained incinerators and apparently got a new incinerator, and they're like, we're just incinerating this material. The city of Cincinnati has used incinerators, but the incinerators are located near the city center. And what has been pushing a lot of cities away from incineration is that it has impacts on air quality, and especially in sort of dense urban centers, increasing regulations around air quality has actually moved some cities away from incineration, especially as those facilities are aging out and they're looking at alternative ways of managing it. And so some are like, incineration is the old way of doing things, but we don't want to do that anymore because of air quality risks and problems. Landfilling is something that a lot of cities do, but that does also incur costs for tipping fees. So anytime that you're dumping, huge amounts of this material to landfill, that costs the city to do so. And so what the calculus has been for many cities is like, can we manage it in a way that actually the costs of reusing it would be lower than those tipping fees? And so that is another sort of facet of that sort of the economic calculus of like, can we find enough sites close to the city center that logistically are manageable, and will that actually be more cost effective than dumping it? And in some smaller towns, like sometimes it is just easier to dump it, and in other cities, they've seen the investment in biosolids application and use as this kind of green urban sustainability sort of ethos. And so they're kind of investing in it with the hope that it will be economically sustainable as well. But I think in a lot of cases, it's never profitable. It just means less cost for the city. And so that is really what's happening. So the city where I live, Columbus, it recycles. In 2017, it accomplished 100% reuse of its sanitation waste, or that's what it claims. And there are 4 different pathways that it has developed. And the reason why it developed this was because the incinerator, one of the major incinerators in the city, broke, and the capital investment to build a new incinerator was so costly. And they said, like, can we start working with existing partnerships and move away just completely from incineration and do 100% reuse? And so because of infrastructural failure, they started moving in this other direction. And because of the differential sort of capital investments, that was another reason why they opted for that. So now the city where I live composts about 30% of it. I think 25% of it is in liquid form that's injected into large-scale industrial fields. They're producing commodity corn and soy. Another percentage of it is going into old strip mine land, so land that has been mined, that is completely degraded, where there's no soil. They dig trenches in it, put that biosolids material, and then plant poplar trees. And so they're creating forestry projects out of degraded landscapes using biosolids as a primary kind of fertilizer and substrate kind of material that these trees are growing off of. And those trees can then be harvested and used for landscaping as wood chips. And then the 4th avenue is for green energy production, is for biogas. And so with biodigesters, these large domes, and there's lots of biodigester investment in Europe. And a lot of the people that I talked to here in Ohio said, we've been looking to Europe to learn more about how to use biodigesters as a model for biogas. Capturing methane and converting that into electricity, and then that remaining effluent or waste then can also be applied onto agricultural lands. And so there are all these different kind of manners in which different cities are finding reuse as plausible and developing kind of a diverse portfolio. Chicago is probably a city that is by no means at the cutting edge, or it's by no means the most innovative. Like Seattle and many other cities have been reusing their sanitation waste for for decades. And I think Chicago has been moving more and more that direction in the last 10 to 20 years. A city just to the north of Chicago, Milwaukee, is kind of exceptional because they started developing a biosolids program before it was called Biosolids in the 1920s. And so a lot of investment in that city has been around the use of that material. And they now produce a garden product that is dried that can be sold at gardening stores called Millergonite, and it's sold all over the country. And in my reading of the history of that city, there was a lot of kind of debate within the city where some people said, like, is this designed to be a public work that we're providing a service, or are we trying to build a profitable business? And there was always kind of tension between the two, because if we want to build a profitable business, there are certain questions of quality of this material and how we manage it that come into kind of question. And I think for a lot of cities, they're kind of, trying to strike some sort of balance in their management of that, while making it so that it's, it's not profitable, but it's not incurring extra costs. And that ideally is incurring fewer costs for their management of it, while also building goodwill with the city of saying, like, this is part of ecological sustainability and providing different sorts of opportunities for public kind of education around that. I don't know if that answered your questions or comments fully.
Yes, yeah. I don't know if, shall we take some questions from the audience? I don't know if anybody would like to ask a question to Nick. You can also write the question, Christina. If you want to use the chat box, you can also use the chat box for those in the audience. But Christina, go ahead. Yes.
Thanks for this presentation. It was very interesting. I didn't thought about the multi-uses for this material, but that's okay. So just a brief question. In taking the Chicago example, I did not understand if you did some ethnographic work with the population. If you did, what is their big concern about this? Is about the smell, or is about the safety? Because for me, I think we can balance. In one way, we probably can use this. I'm more enthusiastic in the use for biogas, like we do in some places, at least in Europe, for use in the land soil, even for golf camps. Okay, it is not this will not contaminate anything that we are going to eat, but nature is a cycle. So each time that we have the rain following, this will in a certain way contaminate the water. So everything is connected in nature. So I'm a little bit more concerned about that, specifically with the contamination of heavy metals and other things that you mentioned in your presentation. But just a brief curiosity about how people think about this use of waste.
Yeah, I haven't, done kind of, I don't have like source of data about kind of like general populace opinions about some of this stuff, although I have been citing from other sort of sources, people that have been doing that research. And I did have a student that was actually doing surveys on Ohio State's campus with students about biosolids. And it was kind of interesting, like all of the students are okay with chicken manure and with cow manure, But then, biosolids obviously was less acceptable, but so is synthetic fertilizer. And so I think there's kind of this like ethic of sustainability that's sort of like synthetic fertilizer is by far the most commonly used product, but people see that as kind of problematic, as is not organic. And so sort of like sources are coming from animals are acceptable, but people are less comfortable with sources coming from fellow humans and coming from sort of chemical, fertilizer industry. So I don't know where that leaves us. As far as your question, in my interviews with wastewater treatment workers and professionals and people that are managing that, smell is something that always comes up, is that if smell is managed, then it's usually something that people are willing to at least entertain or consider. When the smells are offensive, it's very difficult to get people to accept the use of biosolids. The other thing, as I mentioned, is, pathogens, and people are obviously genuinely concerned about possibility for pathogens that, bacterial or viral pathogens that could be spreading through biosolids. And in the hydraulic sanitation, sort of modern forms of treatment, that's something that's regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, and there are lots of ways to kind of mitigate that. But then the emerging contaminants is that kind of third issue, and there's a lot of unknowns just because a lot of things aren't tested. Heavy metals are tested, and so every kind of municipal sanitation or wastewater district, like there are threshold levels that you cannot go beyond if you want to be able to reuse biosolids. And so in the 1990s, the way the environmental chemist told me is that the United States government started developing this kind of carrot and stick approach. And they say, if you invest and develop kind of composting programs and other programs for better quality biosolids, then, we'll sort of take regulatory burden off you. But if you don't, then like, we're really gonna regulate the hell out of you, is the way that he described it. And so it pushed a lot of people towards other uses of it, and developing kind of, what he would consider, this chemist would consider, as cleaner forms of biosolids, whatever that means, But your comment about, for example, runoff, like it doesn't matter if you're applying synthetic fertilizer or biosolids, like if you're applying it in excess of what is agronomic rates, like that's going to lead to problems with runoff. And so there's lots of problems with runoff here. And it doesn't matter what the source of your kind of nutrients are. I mean, they're going to interact differentially, right, in the soil. But like the end is that if there's excessive application of it, that's a problem. And that's something that we've seen in the history of biosolids, especially because every city, because of the diverse inputs, it creates diverse outputs. So some cities have very high phosphorus rates. And if you apply that material on farmland, looking at its nitrogen and not looking at the phosphorus, you're putting way too much phosphorus on the ground. And so like phosphorus runoff is a problem because people were applying it at agronomic rates, looking only at nitrogen. So these are like conversations that will come up with farmers and people talking about the kind of history of its use. The other kind of concerns, if we go back to your question of biogas as an alternative, right? The funny thing is that like, and thinking about these ecologies, like, okay, there's always going to be consequences. And so with biogas, like you're capturing that methane energy, but you still have this liquid like material effluent that you have to do something with. So where does that go? And what is the composition of that material? And I don't know, like it would be interesting for me to look more into the cases of Europe. I know like Germany is invested heavily in biogas, and I'm sure there's biogas investment in Portugal and elsewhere. But then like, how is that material after the methane gas is captured? How's that material managed? And here, that material is reapplied onto agricultural lands oftentimes. But that is also kind of complicated because the composition of that material that's used for biogas is oftentimes different than stuff that's coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. And this is another sort of tangent, but in my research, when I started talking to people in biogas, the people that are producing biogas are taking on lots of waste. So some of them are taking sanitation waste, but they're also taking food waste. They're taking all sorts of other types of organic waste. And it becomes incredibly complex, the diversity of waste that they use. And that material that they have at the end, after they've captured that gas, I think is actually less regulated than the material that's coming from the city municipal sanitation system. And so the people working in regulated kind of municipal sanitation waste think that the biogas material that's used as a fertilizer is a problem because there's less regulation around its composition. It just gets very exceedingly complex for me, but thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
I don't know if there's another question from the audience.
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah, Bruna. Okay.
Yeah.
We cannot hear you very well, Bruna.
Really? Okay.
Okay,
Now
I can. Now I can.
Okay, it was
yes.
the mask.
Okay.
I love the talk, first of all. It was very interesting. My question is about, I don't know if you heard of fatbergs. Cities nowadays have a lot of problems sanitation-wise in the system because of clunks of like little islands of fat that form because people put their grease through the toilet because they don't know how to dispose of it. And listening to your talk, I just kind of started thinking how those little, if we wanted to make biosolids to use to from cities that have very population growth, how those little islands of fat are going to impact the system of biosolids, if it's going to hurt them, if it going, maybe the smell it's going to be worst, I imagine, because it's pure fat, and if it's going to hurt the system of biosolids if we want to implement that in a city.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bruna. And the fatbergs, like you'll see images in like London where there's like, you know, these like infamous fatbergs that clog the entire system. Yeah, and here in the US, people in the industry recall they talk about as fog, fats, oil, and grease. And that is a huge problem, largely because it threatens the infrastructure that all this material is being derived from. And so when I visit some of these different sanitation sites and look at the infrastructure around processing of biosolids, you know, before you even get to anywhere close to that, like there's so much just filters and screens developed to be able to kind of, you know, remove all of this extraneous material, which includes like basketballs and raccoons and like all of these things that get into the system that, you know, people working at the wastewater treatment will tell you about. And then it gets finer and finer mesh. But here in the city of Columbus, where I live, like visiting one of the rooms where it filters out that material, like that room is the most disgusting, offensive smelling room of any of them. Like the biosolids doesn't smell like anything compared to the room where they store all of that material. And so, you know, the thing that you're kind of pointing out that is the problem is that for us as individual users of this sanitation system, like we have no responsibility on the other end. And so there's no motivation for us. And it's not even part of our thinking about like how the material that I'm directing into my drain has an impact further down the line, or much less like on, you know, processing of farmers' fields. So I've kind of like thought of it as like this social black hole where we just like things go in, we don't have to think about where they go out somewhere else in the multiverse. And like we know intellectually that's not true, but that's kind of how we relate to it, right? And so then it would require people to actually think, develop some like conscientiousness around like, okay, there are certain materials that maybe are better not going down the drain. And that becomes very neoliberal, right? It's like individual responsibility to like remove, you know, the oil that you were going to pour down your drain. So, you know, then the question is, are there kind of alternative systems of managing it? But yeah, it continues to be an issue. And in addition to the fog, the fats, oils, and grease, you know, there lots of problems with just disposable diapers and other disposable kind of sanitary products that people just kind of flush, disposable wipes in this country for babies. You know, it's like you've had images of just sanitation stations that are completely clogged with them, just huge balls of just these, you know, sanitary napkins that, you know, you say like, oh, you have your baby, you want to wipe them. That makes sense. I've had a child and you just like want to clean them out for whatever way necessary, but they don't biodegrade, you know, and so then at the other end of that system, it is a huge problem to manage.
Thank you.
I don't have a solution, unfortunately, Bruna. But it is like one of many different pieces of the system that's complicated, you know, and that has to be kind of managed.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Nick, we have another question from Marianne. I'm going to ask the question. She wrote it to me.
Okay.
And it's basically, she's asking, or she's saying, or she's noting that the vegan movement uses the term speciesism to define a hierarchy between humans and other, you know, animal species. And so she would like to know whether you found in your ethnographic research something related to that hierarchy of value, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the way that people seem to be more willing to accept animal manure as opposed to using something like biosolids.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, would it be relevant to kind of explain the, you know, widespread acceptance of animal, you know, biosolids or non-human animal biosolids as opposed to human, you know, biosolids?
Yeah, so there's this interesting inversion, right? Is that there's this kind of anthropocentrism and speciesism, and we kind of put ourselves in this sort of elevated post, or some of us do maybe, compared to other species on the planet. But then when we're talking about waste, it's inverted. And so the sort of access to human waste is seen as kind of the most vile. And, you know, and what I've seen with, for example, even, you know, students I've worked with doing surveys, like it's interesting how other species, you know, forms of manure waste are seen as more acceptable. And the thing that I think is interesting about that is like, there's a level of abstraction, and then there's also the level of direct, immediate experience. And so like I've had in these surveys, like students are very okay with cow manure and chicken litter. Well, like cow manure, for those of us that have experienced it, like there are lots of reasons in terms of its like biomaterial makeup that is less offensive. Cows are eating grass. The odors that are produced by cow manure are less offensive to our human noses. That probably has whatever, you can unpack that how you want. But like chicken litter, if you're exposed to it in mass, is like, it's an intense experience. I had a student that said like living in rural Ohio, she was in the track team and a runner. And she said, you know, they were running one day by a field where a farmer was putting on chicken manure on the field. And a lot of people stopped and started vomiting because of the intense, like overpowering smell that was produced by these animals. So like in that case, like maybe chicken litter is not more acceptable than biosolids and like a very immediate visceral reaction to it. But I think in sort of the abstract, yeah, I think that the simple idea of like proximity to one's waste is almost antithetical to like notions of like civilization, right? And notions of being like a proper sort of human subject to something that you would want distance from. And what I find kind of interesting about this research is what happens when we start, for lack of a better term, fucking with that ideology. Like what happens when we start moving across that sort of boundary and thinking about it. And, you know, a lot of people that work with biosolids have a different sort of opinion of it. And if you look at a lot of animal waste that's produced, for example, in this country, there are probably greater health concerns around it from a scientific standpoint, because there's less regulatory and infrastructural investment around the treatment of it. So like with hog waste or like swine manure, like with all of the kind of diverse antibiotics that are being used for these animals in industrial agriculture, like there are lots of concerns around the swine manure, and they're not treated in the same way that human waste is in the sanitation system. But I think in the abstract, people think like, oh, well, pig poop's probably not as bad as human poop for use on an agricultural field, or for use in a park. And I think, yeah, I think you're totally right that that ideology is present, exists. And one of the things in this research that I've been trying to understand and try to like tease out of this work is like when people talk about their concerns around biosolids and its safety, how much of that is just social taboo that they can't say like, well, I just don't want to because it's gross. Sometimes people will say that, but then sometimes people will say, well, okay, maybe it's treated, but there are these other reasons why I don't like it. And even when you answer their concerns, there's still like a resistance to it. So I think that social taboo is sort of an overarching kind of umbrella or framework, and then emerging contaminants and other kind of concerns around its chemical composition, I think are used to kind of reinforce that framework or used as evidence to reinforce that ideology. That's my suspicion. I don't know, does that kind of make sense? Yeah. But yeah, I think that's a critical piece.
I mean, sort of related to this question is the term. I mean, I have some. I'm a bit curious about the history of the term biosolids. I mean, you didn't really touch on the issue, but it seems to me that it's a fairly recent sort of concept.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that if you want, but go ahead, go further.
Yeah, and you know, to what extent that is connected on the one hand to an attempt to kind of de-emphasize proximity to humans, right? And so create this more abstract, nature-connected kind of concept, biosolid. Anything that has bio nowadays is supposed to be cool. And to what extent it's actually explicitly also connected to an ideal. I mean, you mentioned that in your conclusion, but you know, these new ideas about environmental sustainability, the circular economy, you know, how explicit that is in the way, for example, that municipal governments like the one in Chicago are pushing for the usage of biosolids. You know, just to make it a little bit more explicit, you know, I'm assuming that's part of the whole package, right? I mean, that's part of the whole. Yeah. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I regret because it's like I have a paper that kind of gives all of this background stuff, and then I went right into the sort of nitty-gritty of the Chicago case. But the term biosolids, in my understanding, was developed by this international organization, the Water Environment Federation, in 1992. And you're exactly right that the reason that this term, you know, came into usage was that the previous usage in English was really, you know, sludge. And sludge in English has disgusting connotations. And so to be able to distance biosolid, or to distance this material from human disgust, from human concerns, from this, like, you know, abject sort of connotations, then in my understanding, they started developing, you know, different sorts of terms that might be more benign, more acceptable, and ways to essentially rebrand or reinvent sanitation waste or sanitation sludge. And so, yeah, biosolids was introduced as an alternative term in 1992, or at least in 1992, the United States Environmental Protection Agency started employing that term. And, you know, anybody that, you know, is in that industry, you know, it's a common term that's used internationally now. But it's also a term that critics seize on because they're like, you are trying to make this some other thing, and you're trying to kind of reinvent sanitation waste, but we know what this is. And, you know, in like Google Scholar alerts, I have like biosolids alerts that send me all the papers with biosolids, but almost it's almost always kind of technical engineering, hydraulic engineering sort of papers and papers that from a very kind of technical sense. And I don't see a lot of kind of like critical social theoretical engagement with that term. And that might be, something interesting to look into further. But yeah, I think it was a way to establish linguistic, social, and historical distance from bodily waste. And, we know that this has always been happening to some extent, euphemistic use. In, the Victorian era of London, night soil was the common term, which was really not treated sanitation, or it wasn't, treated waste. It was waste that was recovered from privies and from cesspits, material where people deposited it. And then it was, collected and moved into the rural countryside as a fertilizer. And night soil was the kind of euphemism, de facto euphemism of that area. And that still is a term that, is circulating. I'll see in academic work and scholarly work, the term night soil. And biosolids has become this, technical one. And also I think biosolids does have some specificity around it, in that it is sanitation waste that is produced in a hydraulic sanitation system that is then treated. And so it is distinct from night soil or just from raw sludge. And talking to people, engineers and workers in wastewater treatment, they also emphasize, like, yes, biosolids is not the same as human waste. And even in my discussion of it, I probably conflate the two. But their point is that when that material goes into a treatment facility, there are these huge tanks that are full of microbes and all these diverse microbial forms that are eating that material. And all of that material is being consumed by this crazy, diversity of life forms that have been cultivated in these systems. And a lot of the engineers I talk to say, like, we're creating conditions in nature here in the system that can manage this and treat this material. And when you get the end product of biosolids, what they say is, like, you're not getting human poop. What you're getting is like the great grandchild of a microbe that ate your poop, So like all of these microbial bodies are rapidly cycling through. And so when you actually get the material that's produced, the volume of it or the mass of it actually increases, because what you're getting is not waste that's just been sitting or treated. Like, you're getting microbial mass that is being moved through the system. And so it is a different sort of, it's a biologically and physically distinct entity after it goes through that process. I probably have butchered some aspects of it technically, but that's essentially what's happening, and so it is distinct.
And the Chicago government is trying to kind of promote that kind of awareness of those realities behind the biosolid kind of production and so on and so forth, and linking it to environmental sustainability, right? Is that right?
Yeah, and so there's different ways in which cities have tried to do this. And if we think about kind of the modernist ideal of infrastructure, it's invisible, right? It sort of exists, but you don't actually have to see it, to deal with it. And that's kind of its beauty. It's almost like magic. I flush the toilet, it goes away. I don't have to worry about it. And what's now happening is, because there's more concern about sustainability in this kind of circular economy, now we have to make this visible, and we have to kind of communicate how this actually happens to provide some sort of information and awareness, so that people just don't think of it as this disgusting thing that I want to rid myself of. So it's actually kind of reversing that sort of ideological tendency of invisibilization of infrastructure. And the city does that, the city of Chicago does that through many different ways, where they have public talks and tours where they bring people in. They do virtual talks during COVID to come and get people to see it. They've developed lots of booklets that are cartoons and ones that are designed as didactic materials for children from grade school, up into high school, of providing some sort of awareness of this kind of infrastructure and why it's sort of important to the city. But it's very difficult to counter that overarching tendency of just like, I want my waste away from me. And it's hard to get people, you know, especially like grade school kids, like, how do you cultivate interest in infrastructure, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the most extreme example of trying to convince people that, you know, there's nothing wrong with human waste is in Hong Kong, in certain sort of wastewater treatment plants. They've built spas.
Wow.
And so part of the process of, you know, getting students, of course, you know, students in schools, they go there on tours, and part of the process of trying to kind of familiarize them with the realities of, I suppose, the human waste processing processes, right? You know, it's to show them, okay, you can have a spa in the water that is used to treat human shit, and you'll be fine. You know, nothing is going to happen to you. You know?
That's
anyway,
incredible.
Yeah, maybe this is a good way to put an end to this talk.
Well, a good segue to the next talk. And please also
yeah,
send me the link to your talk, because I very much want to attend.
I don't know if anybody would like to ask a final question. If not, maybe please join me in thanking Nick Kawa once again for this wonderful talk. And just to remind you that the BioSocial talks will continue on July 28th, same time at 2 p.m. Lisbon time, with another talk on human shit, actually, political ecologies of human shit. So we'll stay on this theme. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
See you in our next session.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, I really appreciate
Thank you, everyone,
the
for being there. Thank you, Gonzalo, for taking these last parts instead of your shape not very well. Okay, see you next week. And
see you. And thanks again, Gonzalo. And please do send that link when you have it.
Yes. Let's stay in touch. I'll send you the link. Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.